Perfect. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our synergy session that we've called A Risky Business, How Canada Manages Threats to Critical Infrastructure. My name is Mike Clare, delighted to be your host here today. I am in the Genesis boardroom on the St. John's campus of Memorial University, along with a bunch of people here. And as well, we have some people watching on the internet. So welcome, everybody. I never think of the plumbing in my house. I never think of the electrical system. I never think of the wireless system, unless it goes wrong, and then I think about it all the time. And I think that's a good definition of infrastructure. Infrastructure is the stuff that you rely on without thinking about it until it goes wrong, and then it kind of takes over your life. In the early part of the 21st century, we are totally dependent upon all types of infrastructure. Water and sewer for public sanitation, streets and highways for employment, commerce, and leisure, airports for long-distance travel, cell towers for continuous communications, etc., etc. And we've seen what can happen to a region when the infrastructure gives way. Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, is a perfect example of what happens when your infrastructure is no longer there. People die or are greatly inconvenienced. Economies falter and people lose their jobs. So infrastructure is key to our society. So let's take a minute today to think about the infrastructure under our care. Let's take a break from our hectic schedules to do a check on whether we've forgotten anything important in case we're faced with a natural or man-made disaster. Our guest speaker today will lead us into this reflection. I'm going to introduce him in a moment, but first, to give him a sense of who is taking part in today's presentation, we're going to go around the room. I'll pass the microphone around the room so that you can introduce yourself, who you are, and if you have an affiliation, we'd like that. But I'll start by listing off the people who are on the internet. And Jennifer, is there a list of the people there that... We don't have the names that show up. Oh, the names don't show up. Okay, so I think we're exploring different kinds of platforms. Okay, so we do know that there are 7 of you out there online, so thank you very much for joining us. We just can't tell who you are, or how many of you are watching the same screen. But I'll start over here with Jennifer. Say who you are and then pass it along to John.
I'm Jennifer. I'm with the Harris Center.
Hi, John Duff, also with the Harris Center.
I'm Kim Bell, ecologist.
Dave James with the Office of the Chief Risk Officer at MON.
Mitch Rumbold with the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary here in St. John's, and I do emergency management planning.
Richard Sparks with Public Safety Canada. I'm Senior Emergency Management Officer here in St. John's.
Keith Bowden with MON Facilities Management.
I'm Jason Daniels with Facilities Engineering and Major Capital with Memorial University.
Kim Wise, I'm retired, which means I have time to, hi Kim, I have time to attend these interesting discussions.
Thank you, Jim. I'll introduce our guest speaker in a second, but before I do, I've got a couple of other things. So for those of you, we're going to be about 90 minutes in this session. Half of it is going to be a presentation from our guest speaker, and the other half is a discussion with you in the audience. So for those of you who are here with me, I'll get the microphone over to you so that the people online can hear your brilliant question or comment. For those of you who are online, you will see a text box somewhere on your screen. And if you have a question or a comment, simply
email to harriscenter@mon.ca.
If you have a brilliant question or comment, email it to Harris Center, so Harris Center, all one word, British spelling of center, TRE, at mun.ca. I'll repeat the email address later on, but send us an email if you'd like, if you have a question or a comment, and either Jennifer or John will read it out for our speaker to answer. And we're going to alternate between the people in this room and the people with questions on the internet. We're recording the video, just the presentation part of the video. We won't be archiving the Q&A session, so feel free to criticize your employer if you want. We're not going to be archiving that. But it will be archived in a few days. If you want to review the presentation, you'll have a chance to do it. We're going to finish at 2 o'clock Newfoundland time. And one last thing before I introduce our speaker is that economic development is a contact sport. It consists of getting people together, learning about their skills and expertise, and matching these skills and expertise with specific projects. Is a way to expedite the sharing of knowledge and projects. Created by the Harris Center, this database allows for sharing of knowledge and projects. It allows us to connect the resources of Memorial University with the needs of the community, and the resources of the community with the needs of the university. So I invite you to visit www.yaffle.ca. So a yaffle is a Newfoundland word, means an armload of something, whether it's salt fish or wood or whatever, so that you can connect with your colleagues in the community and at the university. And if you'd like more information about Yaffle, just please see me after the session, and I would be happy to inform you about that. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Kevin Quigley is the scholarly director of the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance, and a professor in the School of Public Administration at Dalhousie University in Halifax. He specializes in public sector risk and crisis management, strategic management, and critical infrastructure protection. Kevin founded the Critical Infrastructure Protection Initiative, an interdisciplinary research team seeking to enhance collaboration for the management of Canada's critical infrastructure. He's published an acclaimed book on critical infrastructure, numerous articles in academic journals, and his new book, Too Critical to Fail: How Canada Manages Threats to Critical Infrastructure, is now available. So please welcome Kevin Quigley to Newfoundland and Labrador and to the podium.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Mike. I want to point out, first of all, that when you receive a robust and gracious welcome at an institute, I know myself from running an institute that usually there's quite a bit of work that went on before that gracious reception, and the more gracious often the more work that went on. So I just want to say thank you so much to the Harris Center for hosting me today. This is a great opportunity to discuss some of the research I've been doing over the last 10 years or so that's captured in the book, though the presentation will not take 10 years, I hope. But anyway, it's very nice to be here. And I would say with the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance, we've just started that new center. We opened it up about 18 months ago. And we're really at the very early stages of exploring the kind of research impact we want to have in Atlantic Canada. And we're looking at centers like the Harris Center, who've been in business a lot longer than we have for leadership and guidance and partnership. So we look forward to working with the Harris Center and learning from them and the excellent work they've done here. So I'm really delighted to be here at the Harris Center today. The MacEachen Institute has 4 research themes: Atlantic Canada and the world, civic engagement, and smart infrastructure. And so what I want to talk about today is something about smart infrastructure. Necessarily, of course, this is just a kind of, I'm going to try to be as coherent as possible given the framework that I've got in terms of discussing the infrastructure, but I will say that it's kind of highlights of some of the stuff in the book that I've, as I say, worked on for quite some time with Ben Bissett and Brian Mills. And so I'm happy to take whatever questions and look forward to discussion afterwards about what your impressions are and other contributions you might like to make to this this field. I'd be delighted to hear it. So it's just necessarily some highlights. So on May 13th, 2014, while he worked with his young son on his boat in the backyard, Thomas Harding was surrounded by a SWAT team, sirens wailing, and led away in handcuffs. Later that day, he and 2 colleagues, Jean Demetre and Richard Labrie, were marched into a makeshift courtroom in full view of the press in a town still in ashes. They were charged with 47 counts of criminal negligence causing death. The temporary courthouse was in Lac-Mégantic, a town most people had never heard of before the early hours of July 6, 2013, when the brakes failed on an unattended freight train carrying 7.7 million liters of petroleum in the form of crude oil. As we know, 47 people died, 2,000 people were evacuated, and the downtown core was destroyed. It was the deadliest rail disaster in Canada since Confederation. In its report on the incident, published 3 months after Mr. Harding appeared in court, the Transportation Safety Board pointing to 18 distinct causes and contributing factors. 25 different companies were accused of sharing responsibility for the derailment, and they contributed approximately $450 million for an out-of-court settlement fund for the victims. At virtually the same time as flames ripped through Lac-Mégantic on the other side of the country, a good portion of the Canadian province of Alberta sat underwater. Between June 19th and July 12th, 2013, heavy rainfall triggered the worst flooding in Alberta's history, which washed across nearly 1/4 of the province. 5 people died as a result of the floods, and over 100,000 were forced to leave their homes. 30 communities declared local states of emergency. The province declared its first ever state of emergency. Nearly 14,500 homes were damaged, 80 schools and 10 healthcare facilities were affected. Most estimates put the final cost of the flood in excess of $6 billion, which at the time made it the costliest disaster in Canadian history. The findings of the flood post-mortem conducted by the accounting firm M&P LLP were largely positive. The report concluded that extensive emergency management skills, capability, and legislation exist within the province. It deemed the public safety governance framework document developed after the 2011 Slave Lake fires to be effective and recommended that it continue to be used and refined. Polls suggested people felt very positive about the role of public servants in the flood response, with 82% of Albertans describing the work done by emergency responders as excellent, and further 12% describing it as good. The UK newspaper The Guardian noted that the mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi, emerged from the crisis with a folk hero status, with friendly vandals taping his face onto Superman posters and other people producing fundraising t-shirts with an illustration of the mayor wearing a scuba mask, accompanying the slogan, "Keep calm and Nenshi on." Of the $6 billion in losses caused by the flood, only $2 million was covered by insurance. As a result, the Alberta government announced in its disaster recovery programs it would recover $3.1 billion in uninsurable loss and damage suffered by individuals, small businesses, municipalities, and other groups. Ultimately, the program funded a number of losses that were beyond the program's original scope. So we might classify both of these events, Lac Mégantic and the Alberta floods, as black swans, which are low probability, high consequence disasters with elements of randomness and bad luck. Yet the juxtaposition of these two cases raises important questions about the manner in which we prepare for and respond to disasters in our communities. Despite the fact that the Alberta floods cost 13 times more than the train derailment in Lac Mégantic, why was there 3 times more media coverage of the derailment than the floods? Given that both events were devastating and costly, what explains the negative assessment of key actors and processes in the media coverage and audits after the Lac Mégantic derailment, but the relatively positive assessment of actors and processes after the Alberta floods? Why in Lac Mégantic were some held to account in a specific, intense, and public manner, while others implicated in the derailment remained largely anonymous and silent? While the post-mortem in Alberta was largely positive and some actors were celebrated, why were the town planners not held to account for planning decisions that exposed communities to such death? The comparison between the Lac Mégantic derailment and the Alberta floods highlights an important dimension of such disasters. However random they may seem, disasters occur in a particular political, market, legal, social, psychological, cultural, geographic, and popular context, which influences the likelihood and consequences of these events and contributes to the manner in which we interpret, respond to, and apportion blame for them. So between 2011 and 2014, we interviewed 68 officials for our research. We have about 700 pages of transcript. We focused largely on the transportation and dangerous chemical sector. Most interview subjects were Canadian, but we also interviewed Americans, British, and Australian officials to provide some comparative context. We examined media coverage of 40 different post-9/11 disasters. We included natural disasters, industrial failures, terrorist attacks, terrorist plots, pandemics, and cyber events. We are public administration and risk scholars. We use the Hood, Rothstein, and Baldwin risk regulation regimes framework to structure the analysis. The framework takes a multidisciplinary approach to understanding risk. It hypothesizes that context shapes the manner in which a risk is regulated, or as they put it, context shapes content. Hood and colleagues test 3 separate but overlapping hypotheses. The first hypothesis, the market failure hypothesis, examines the government's intervention as a necessary one given the technical nature of the risk and the inability of the market to manage the risk effectively without such intervention. The opinion responsive hypothesis examines media coverage and polling data and assesses regulation as a response to the preferences of civil society. The third hypothesis, the interest group hypothesis, examines the role of organized groups in shaping the manner in which risk is regulated in industry. Hood and colleagues used 3 separate hypotheses to determine the extent to which contextual pressures explain the policy settings, the configuration of state and other organizations directly engaged in regulating the risk, and the attitudes, beliefs, and operating convention of the regulators. Each of the 3 critical elements of regime content is characterized further through the 3 elements of a cybernetic control system: information gathering, standard setting, and behavior modification. So the key here is that if you want to control a system, you need to have a capacity to gather information about that system, set the standards, and change the behavior. And if you can't do all 3, then your system's not under control. So what is critical infrastructure? CI is a concept, and I'll call it CI. CI is a concept originated in the computer science and engineering literature, and references to it are much more likely to be found in engineering journals than social science ones. The concept of infrastructure and protecting it against threats is an ancient one, and in fact, I spend at least some of my time thinking about how ancient societies did it. But our modern understanding of CI grew partly out of our vulnerabilities that emerged in the change from big box computing in the 1950s and 60s, in which large machines did all the computing work and existed under the control of the IT department, to highly dispersed technologies such as desktops and microchips, whose use grew exponentially in the 80s and 90s. The emergent networks became more complex and difficult to control. While the new systems increased efficiencies, they also created vulnerabilities to supply chains, manifested during events like the year 2000 computer bug, Y2K, which prompted much more careful examination of risks in our CI. Governments use broad definitions of critical infrastructure. The first definition of CI was adopted in the United States, for example. It was put forward by President Clinton in Executive Order 1310 in 1996. It noted that certain national infrastructures are so vital that their incapacity or destruction would have a debilitating impact on the defense or economic security of the United States. Definitions have changed over time. Most definitions now emphasize the impact on people when CI fails. Canada's National Strategy for Critical Infrastructure defines CI as, quote, processes, systems, facilities, technologies, networks, assets, and services essential to the health, safety, security, or economic well-being of Canadians and the effective functioning of government. A review by the OECD of CI definitions argues that most countries use a broad definition of CI, and it's largely consistent across countries, though we do point out in the book some national differences, and I think they're worthy of note. Partly because of the context in which that CI is situated. I think national differences make a difference. In Canada, there are 10 critical infrastructure sectors: health, food, finance, water, information and communication technology, safety, which means emergency services largely, energy and utilities, manufacturing, government, transportation. I'll note that we did a lot of work on dangerous chemicals, and that falls under manufacturing. Canada's National Strategy and Action Plan, I think I actually might be moving on. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Canada's National Strategy and Action Plan note that high-impact, low-frequency events, including black swans, are rare but devastating and require attention because of the potential for massive loss should they occur. Much of the CI literature includes references to disasters. The literature frequently brings our attention to the fragile and interdependent nature of CI, pointing out that one small, seemingly innocuous failure can have a massive impact. For example, overgrown trees in Ohio contributed to the failure of the Northeast power grid in 2003, which affected over 55 million people, cost over $10 billion, and left some without power for a week. It was the second largest blackout in history. The focus in both the popular media and the academic literature lies squarely on low probability, high consequence events. It need not necessarily, but it does. So due to the complexity, interdependence, and consequences of failures in CI, the National Strategy for CI in Canada has 3 strategic objectives: build partnerships, implement an all-hazards risk management approach, and advance the timely sharing and protection of information among partners. So I'll take a moment to describe the general characteristics of the regimes using the cybernetic terms information gathering, standard setting, and behavior modification. The primary focus of risk regulator efforts in CI appears to be gathering of information. Governments have made large investments in information gathering mechanisms, and private sector CI operators are often subject to reporting requirements, sometimes mandatory, but often voluntary. It's not clear, however, the information exchange is always meaningful or successful. While our interview participants were nearly unanimous in their endorsement of information gathering and sharing tools, calling them important mechanisms for building trust and ensuring shared approaches to risk management, they often could not articulate concrete benefits of these tools. More often, they talked about feeling reassured by being part of a community and getting to know key players, and they talked about the value of briefings, even if they were often general in nature. Standard setting, the second component of the control mechanism, is characterized by a mix of fixed and flexible standards. Generally in CI, there's a preference for flexibility and compromise over conventional command and control instruments. Under this model, governments set broad guidelines and disseminate best practices, which are interpreted and applied by industry associations or individual firms in the manner best suited for their circumstances. Behavior modification appears to represent the smallest component of the regime. We heard from many interview participants that governments dedicate relatively fewer resources to legislative and regulatory enforcement, conducting inspections, applying penalties, prosecuting lawbreakers. These activities demand significant investments and large bureaucracies. So what context explains this dynamic? Let's turn our attention to the 3 contextual pressures: markets, public opinion, and organized interests. And we'll start with markets. Most CI is owned and operated by the private sector. Government strategies typically assume a partnership with industry. They assume a degree of goodwill by those who participate in CI forums, but it's not clear that the goodwill is necessarily present among participating organizations. Despite the government's emphasis on trust building in these fora, it's not clear that trust is clearly defined. Are we talking about trust in people, trust in process, outcomes, institutions? Not sure. If you can't define it, how would we know if we can achieve it? Finally, is trust even desirable in all circumstances? A healthy skepticism might be just as useful as trustworthiness in certain circumstances. There are numerous reasons to withhold information about vulnerabilities about which critical infrastructure, upon which you depend. Security, liability, share value, and public image, to name a few. Finally, when government CI owners and operators share information, it is assumed that by sharing information, everyone will act in accordance with the public good. This is not necessarily so. Public and private sector interests are not necessarily aligned, nor are the interests of the competing CI owners. The law and insurance are two important market regulators in risk, but their impact is constrained in critical infrastructure protection and big bang disasters. Black swans are notoriously difficult to insure against because there's insufficient data for insurance companies to develop sustainable policies. As J. David Cummins emphasizes, quote, catastrophic events, and particularly mega catastrophes such as Katrina and the World Trade Center terrorist attack, violate to some degree almost all the standard conditions for insurability. Insurance after black swans usually requires heavy subsidies. The legal process is slow due to the complexity of the systems. In one extreme example, the Exxon Valdez took over 20 years to resolve. Given our proximity to Nova Scotia, I'd be remiss if I did not mention the Westray legislation. In 1992, an incident at the Westray coal mine in Nova Scotia caused the death of 26 miners. The subsequent public inquiry revealed, quote, an almost willful avoidance of basic safety by the mine operator, coupled with a do-nothing attitude by the provincial safety inspector overseeing the working conditions of the mine, end quote. In 2004, the federal government implemented changes to the criminal code that affected how corporations are held accountable for their actions. Bill C-45, the so-called Westray Bill, extended the criminal liability of corporations in the field of health and safety. It is no longer necessary to prove criminal intent when prosecuting companies for offenses such as criminal negligence. The absence of claims under the Westray legislation, however, raises questions about the effectiveness of its provisions. Researchers have noted a new consulting market in Canada in which lawyers and occupational safety experts advise companies on how to avoid responsibility under the Westray amendments, effectively non-criminalizing workplace accidents. Another more recent example occurred earlier this year concerning the Algo Mall collapse in Northern Ontario in 2012, which killed 2 people and injured 19. In his decision, Supreme Court Justice Edward Gatto found that former engineer Robert Wood, who had inspected the parking lot just before it collapsed, was not guilty of criminal charges stemming from the incident in Elliott Lake. Wood, whose work the judge described as shoddy, sloppy, and even inadequate, however, must accept moral responsibility for what occurred, Gatto declared in his decision. It's difficult to understand the weight and consequence of such a vague and unenforceable concept of guilt. Teresa Perlozzolo, daughter of one of the 2 women who died in the mall collapse, accepted the findings but had hoped somebody, quote, would get nailed with it. The suspect manner with which Wood discharged this responsibility and the profound consequences of that performance, her frustration is understandable in light of that. I'll come back to the issue of industrial failures later in the talk. So overall, we found the market failure hypothesis is only partially applicable to CI sectors we examined. The existing market mechanisms in place to manage these risks are only partly effective, and in some cases slow and weak. If the regime reflected the market failure hypothesis, we'd likely see more aggression in regulating the risk, particularly in adherence to standards and behavior change. In our view, the technical nature of low probability, high consequence risks is not the sole or even the primary explanatory variable for regime content. The opinion responsive hypothesis, this is the second contextual hypothesis. The opinion responsive hypothesis directs our attention to the correlation between regime content and public preferences and attitudes. According to this hypothesis, regulatory efforts will focus on the risks of most concerns to citizens. Studying the validity of this argument requires measuring public concern, which can be done in various ways and none are without controversy. Public polling offers one source of data, as does media coverage. So we'll start with media coverage of disasters, and I'll pivot a little bit and deviate a little bit from my script. So one of the things we did was we looked at, as I said, 40 post 9/11 disasters in various categories: natural disasters, industrial failures, terrorist attacks, terrorist plots, cyber events, things like that. And most of them were Canadian, though we did also, and I'll say that the events were, this is all strictly the Globe and Mail's coverage of these events. So we followed the story for 1 year, starting the day the event started and running for 365 days. So all articles in the Globe and Mail. We have a database that captures a number of aspects, but I want to just focus on two in this particular presentation. So we developed, I say the Globe and Mail is the Canadian source. We also looked at similar events, so industrial failures in Australia, covered by the Australian, by in the UK, by media coverage in the Daily Telegraph, and in the US with coverage from the New York Times. These papers have ideological differences, but they're largely the high volume broadsheet from their country, so that's why we selected them. And there's no question, there's a whole bunch of other stuff you could do on media coverage of disasters if you wanted, but for the purpose of this discussion, this is what we did. We looked at 4 leading broadsheets in these 4 countries, looking at these types of disasters to see if there was a pattern to the coverage or something we might glean from it in terms of how government responds to risk. So I'm going to show you a visual that we developed based on the data we collected. This axis, the vertical axis, is the number of articles in the of the stories. I will say there are some extreme cases like H1N1. We've done H1N1 and it's off the chart, so you're not going to see H1N1. Also, Lac Mégantic was a high volume event, so this is off the chart as well. But this covers about 90% of our events are captured here within about 60 or so articles of in total. The other axis, this horizontal axis, is a performance assessment grid. So this shows how the government was depicted in that media coverage. So if you're on the left-hand side, it's bad because it was negative. Right-hand side, it was positive. So what we did over the 365 days, we did an accumulation of whether or not cumulatively the media coverage was positive in terms of its depiction of the role of government, all 3 orders of government, though usually a disaster will focus on one order of government alone. Right? There's not a lot of coverage of all 3 in most of these events, and then if you're drifting on this side, it's negative, right? So high volume, low volume, positive coverage, and negative coverage on the role of government. As I say, lots of other things we have in that database, but that's what I'd like to talk about today. So what we found was that there were, and you're just going to have to take my word for it, although you're free to look at the method section of the book. There's remarkable similarity in patterns in the media coverage that follows these events. And striking because, in some respects, I think because the events themselves seem so unique, right? These disasters seem like, wow, that'll never happen again. But when you look at the media coverage, it follows quite a predictable pattern, which is striking and maybe something to think about. It probably would help you if you're working in communications and government, because you could, in some cases, probably anticipate media coverage of these disasters in some respects. And I could go on about various patterns that emerged, but I think these are maybe the ones I just want to point out as key. The natural disasters and industrial failures one is one of the ones that I find most interesting. Natural disasters tends to generate, and let me make one little, just a little note, just so I don't feel guilty about it. The natural disasters one generally fits in that box, but it can go over here. It can be a little bit more negative. Our results are a little bit biased by the fact that the British press is almost always negative about everything. So we did the 2007 UK floods, and it did drift over here in the UK. But if you take the UK one out, natural disasters tend to shift a little bit more to the positive. And the reason is because, yeah. So this is just the characterization of the government response or anticipation of the event. This is the media response to that, not how serious the event was or whether the event itself was good or bad. That's right. This is the volume of coverage, the number of articles that appeared in these events for 365 days, and whether the government. So what we did was we reviewed the articles and we made a judgment. Does the government look bad in this article, good in this article, or neutral in this article? So it's mentioned, but there's no judgment. There's no implied judgment, right? And that's the way we assessed and then there was a process of validating those opinions. I'm sorry, if it was a neutral statement, like if the government's noted, but there's no judgment about whether it was a good performance or a bad performance, it just says, the government did something, right? So it could be positive, negative, or neutral. We could have gotten into accountability, but it's harder because it's not always clear who's accountable. So that's why we took a step back and just said, at the end of the day, when you read this article, did the government look good, bad, neutral, or they weren't mentioned at all? Those were the 4 options, right? And so what we found was, with natural disasters, generally gravitate towards positive, very high volume coverage. And part of the reason for this is because it lends itself to very dramatic coverage, right? I mean, it's situated in a sort of media culture of trying to get good stories. Disasters lend themselves to dramatic coverage, fabulous photos, and emergency services is doing the best they can in a bad circumstance, and they usually get very good coverage for it. And neighbors helping neighbors, communities helping other communities, it lends itself to very positive coverage. Industrial failures are overwhelmingly negative. Overwhelmingly negative. The tone of the coverage is very negative. The tone of the headlines is almost entirely negative. Not so with natural disasters, right? Actually, quite a number of the titles are actually, the headlines are actually positive about natural disasters. There's a bit of a mix. But there's a ruthless hunt for accountability in an industrial failure. And so one of the sayings is if you build it, you better maintain it, right? Because when you get into the industrial side, it becomes more negative. Just as an aside, one interesting example of this was Fukushima. Fukushima started off as a natural disaster, and the coverage was very positive in terms of everybody doing their best to respond to this terrible situation. But when it became a story about nuclear, then it went very, very negative. And in fact, then it started to consume a lot of the media coverage. And in fact, and lives lost, the bigger part of the story arguably was the natural disaster. But the industrial failure really sucked a lot of the attention away towards industrial. So in that one case, you could actually see a transition before your very eyes where it started as a natural disaster and the tone was following this pattern, and then it became much more negative. Although I would say Fukushima is not part of our database. This is just an observation I made when I was watching Fukushima. A couple of other things I'll just point out. Terrorist attacks get a lot of coverage, right? And it does tip a little bit more towards the negative, but not dramatically so, like the way industrial failures get really negative. Again, emergency services, government is doing the best it can in something maybe it didn't see coming, but there's a little more criticism for the fact that maybe they didn't seem as coordinated as they could have been. Negative. Failed terrorist plot. So we're talking about Sydney 5, Toronto 18 examples. There, Via Rail is also in this database. Lower volume coverage. Right? This is an event that's been foiled or stopped, so you get very positive coverage of government in that particular case. And I can go over what we looked at in the 40 events, or it's in more detail. The individual events are listed in the book as well. Industrial failures, though, we have bridge collapses, train wrecks, things like that, right? In the 4 countries that we looked at. And they all follow the semi-platter. And then, of course, I have to point out this one, right? Because this, I've just come from a water conference where somebody from the water community was saying, from his point of view, this is the #1 risk that he thinks about, right? A lot of organizations are very troubled by the uncertainty around the potential for cyber attacks and their dependence on technology. But cybers really have a hard time getting media coverage because it doesn't lend itself to a good story. And as I've often said, there are only so many stories the CBC can do with the lights off and a spotlight on somebody at a keyboard, typing away, doing something evil, whoever it might be, wherever they might be, right? That's typically the visual you get, but it's very hard to catch a bad guy. And so far as stories motivate media coverage, interesting human interest story will drive it. Cyber really lacks that. And as a result, it doesn't get a lot of popular attention, which raises questions about whether that's appropriate or not. Is that a good thing or bad? It depends, right? I've talked to some cyber people who say, we don't need a lot of attention necessarily. Like that's going to lead to maybe some unintended consequences. On the other hand, there definitely is a sort of shortage of awareness and knowledge, and maybe a little more information sharing could help, right? But this one really struggles. Now, just as a contrast, I'll just point out that if you're dealing with vulnerable populations, you tend to get a lot of media coverage. So something like child abuse, bullying, things like that happen online, they get tons of coverage, right? And it kind of raises the question about, you know, how do you kind of bring it to sort of popular awareness? Like nobody really wants to talk about credit card fraud and things like that. It's all a little too boring for people, right? Not like these sorts of stories, right? The train wrecks and the bridge collapses and the hurricanes and these sorts of things, right? But this sort of stuff, in the absence of either catching a bad guy or a vulnerable population, and you do see it with, as I say, online bullying and things like that, where that really drives a lot of media coverage immediately, right? It gets a lot of government attention for popular reasons. But in the cyber domain, in the kind of CI domain, not a lot. And I've kind of thought about the extent to which maybe if we kind of try to cross-fertilize those two concepts a little bit, thinking about, you know, how do we teach our kids about online bullying, et cetera, but then how do we also try to open up to a more sophisticated conversation about how do we protect ourselves online and how much do we depend on these systems, et cetera. Right?
So is that where you classify things like the WikiLeaks and now the Paradise Papers are out?
So they're not on the list, Wiki, right? But yeah, that would be there. I think we have about 6 or 7 cyber events. Some of them, or maybe 8 actually. Some of them happened between sort of 07 and 2010. And so I was so convinced by 2014, 2015 that there would probably be a change. I thought surely there's been a maturing on this and we're more aware. So I went back and did some more, including the Sony story. So Sony's in the database, right? The Sony hacking story. Actually, not a lot. I mean, we all are aware of the Sony story, but you'd be surprised how little coverage it actually got. CRA software defect as well. I don't know if you remember that one. You know, I know 2007, they put a patch online and then they had to pull the whole system offline. Again, very little coverage. But if you talk to people who are working in it, they'll say, "Oh, it was a lot of coverage," because they don't get a lot of coverage normally. But it's not anything like what goes on with the terrorist attacks and the industrial failures, right? So it kind of raises interesting questions because when you talk to people in the field, right, they're concerned about these things. Let me go on to some polling data. So what is the most important problem facing Canadians today? What you find, so this is a kind of list of possibilities: terrorism and security, economy, interest rates, healthcare, poor government leadership, unemployment, environment. We tracked this over 10 years. It wasn't us, it was somebody else's source data. And what you see here, this is terrorism, which is 01. I don't know if anything happened in 01 that might have driven up that line. But as you can see, it comes down, 03. And then it pretty much flatlines. A little bump in 06, because of course there's some nastiness going on in Iraq here, and also Canada was on a sort of short list for terrorists in 06, and there was getting a bit of media coverage. So a little bit of a bump, but not really a lot of concern around that issue. The environment, I'll just point out, is here. It's environment's blue. So hovering around 5%, and then there's a little spike in 07, and that got a lot of attention around election time as well, but then lowered down. If you put healthcare, economy, and unemployment together, this is what you get: 40 to 60%, more or less. These are the numbers about what people consider to be the most important things on their mind. How much do you trust the government to do what is right? Of course, this is a number that's been trending downward over the last several decades, right, since the 1960s. Canada does okay compared to some of its allies. It's at 49%. The mean between 2009 and 2015 is 52%. I'll point out that I'm using Edelman Trust on this, if you're familiar with that source. And standard deviation between those 6 years is 4%. You can see it's a little higher than the US, but kind of comparable to Australia and a little bit higher than the UK. Remember, of course, this is after the financial collapse also was happening around that 09 period, so the government and industry not trusted so much, right? So how much do you trust business to do what is right? And this is these are the owners and operators, a lot of the critical infrastructure that we're talking about, and 7%, so a little lower than government. Australia 48, the US trusts industry apparently a lot more, and the UK around 52%. So if you just compare that, government and industry, kind of similar, the way Canadians trust both. But I wanted to sort of do a slightly deeper dive on this and think about the particular sectors themselves rather than just talk about industry in a sort of general sense. Things about trust in these different sectors. Generally, they're higher than government. So if you think about chemicals, which is not necessarily a sector that's normally brought to people's breast very quickly, it actually is not too bad at 57%. Energy, it's a little bit all over the place. Renewable seems to be trusted, but natural gas, utilities, oil, not so much. Hydraulic fracturing, not so much. Banks, not so much. Food and beverage, not too bad. But I'll just bring your attention to look how much technology is trusted, the IT sector, and it kind of goes back to this issue about cyber, that one, you don't get a lot of media coverage, and two, people really trust the technology sector. So it's probably going to create some challenges around managing the risk with that sector if people love the sector and we don't get a lot of high-profile media coverage about mess-ups, right? But that contrasts significantly with what the industry would say. Other thing, family businesses and SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, are highly trusted. Between 2013 and 2015, 72% to 76% of respondents said they trusted SMEs and small businesses. That's 20% higher than large corporations. Okay. So when we look at what concern Canadians most, it's usually economy, healthcare, and unemployment. It's rarely security. It's occasionally the environment. When we looked at public opinion polls, we see variation in trust from certain organization types and particular sectors. When it comes to trust in government, people are ambivalent. This is part of a process that's been occurring across the West for, since the 1960s. People also don't particularly trust large corporations, the likes of which often are responsible for the critical infrastructure upon which we depend, like banking and energy, for example. So as with the market failure hypothesis, we saw mixed support for our evidence for the opinion responsive explanation of regime content. Canadians are not particularly concerned about security, and therefore a regime that focuses largely on information gathering and spends relatively less time and money on standards and behavior change may be consistent with the opinion responsive hypothesis. There are still some powerful misalignments in this hypothesis. Among the disasters we examined, there appears at times to be a preference among media organizations for short-term voyeurism rather than scrutiny, and this seems to be influenced by the pressure to provide big bang, low cost, and sentimental coverage of events, which is driven by audience demand and the competitive nature of the cash-strapped media industry itself. It also has a rather narrow bias towards narratives that create villains and heroes, but that don't necessarily lead to a broader examination of risk and the forward-looking policy challenges and changes that may be required. Moreover, polling data suggests Canadians do not particularly trust government or the government industries that manage CI, and they trust tech and small companies much more, but these organizations ironically seem to embody more unchecked risks. Family businesses and SMEs, for example, are highly trusted, yet these firms are less likely to hold insurance, have risk management expertise, or to have redundancy to respond to or excess capacity to recover from disasters than larger companies. So the public trusts the technology sector the most, and by a good measure. Most people do not worry about their online security, but risk experts do. In the Society of Actuaries 2014 annual survey of emerging risks, 58% of experts identified cybersecurity and interconnected infrastructure as the #1 emerging risk concern, passing climate change concerns for the first time since the survey started. So the interest group hypothesis draws on political science and to frame regulatory regimes in terms of distribution of capabilities, such as power, among actors in a given policy domain. Traditionally, this approach has been used to explain why individuals or firms organize to lobby government. We argued that the interest group hypothesis offers a strong explanation for the features we observed in the chemical and transportation regimes. Specifically, we saw a high degree of alignment between industry preferences and government preferences in subsectors where firms are represented by well-organized, well-funded industry associations, or where there are only a small number of non-competitive operators and fewer regulators. Many regulators, many orders of government. Where there are fewer, it was easier, it seemed, right? There was a meeting of the minds much more quickly between the industry and the regulators. These arrangements are often viewed as negative in terms as a form of regulatory capture, meaning that government simply implements the priorities of the most influential interest groups. Our evidence, however, offers a less pessimistic take on the implications of client politics. As understood by the governance literature, expertise and capacity are no longer located solely or even primarily in government bureaucracies. By maintaining close relationships with chemical and transportation companies, regulators can access and leverage the technical knowledge possessed by industry officials. Through qualified acceptance of self-regulation programs, regulators at the federal level are also able to influence industry behavior in areas under provincial jurisdiction, enabling a higher degree of uniformity to be established across the regime. Still, such a close relationship and interdependence leaves questions about transparency and accountability. So with respect to accountability, Peters refers to 3 types of accountability: answerability, which refers to the rendering an account; responsibility, which refers to following ethical standards in the law; and responsiveness, which refers to responding to the needs of the public. At times, these concepts overlap. So let's start with answerability, and I'm going to select examples from rail, particularly around the time of the Lac-Mégantic disaster and the audits that followed. These are in some ways extreme examples, but as organizational anthropologists point out, it's in extreme conditions that we see how the system really works. And as noted, the CI literature often looks at extreme cases. So the government's response to the 2013 rail safety audit sheds light on the different ways in which government meets or fails to meet Peters' categories of accountability. So I'd like to show you a quotation from an interview between CBC and the Minister of Transport following the publication of the Auditor General's report on rail safety oversight. The audit itself was carried out just before the Lac-Mégantic rail disaster and published a few months after it. So in other words, it didn't actually include Lac-Mégantic. So in the excerpt, the minister, for the most part, refers to the elected government, including herself, as we, okay, as distinct from Transport Canada, which is they. She notes the determined effort the elected government has made to support increased audits and the safety management system, such as, quote, we provided the department in 2009 extra funding, end quote. Despite the fact that the elected government had been in power for over 5 years, she attributes the failings to Transport Canada alone. Indeed, it's difficult to detect in the exchange what, if anything, the elected government might be responsible for in relation to the department's past performance. In the second part of the interview, however, when she emphasizes progress and achievements, she includes the elected government as integral to government operations, such as we will implement the plan and we have actually increased the number of inspectors. So I'll just read that quotation from the CBC. Why were only 1 in 4 safety management audits completed from 2009 to 2013? And the minister replied, well, that's what I asked Transport Canada officials myself when the results of the audit were becoming apparent. You know, we provided to the department in 2009 extra funding to deal with more inspections, to deal with rail safety, and we based it on the fact that we had a very good independent panel tell us from rail safety in Canada in 2007. So for us, we had fully anticipated and expected that not only is Transport Canada doing the compliance work that they should be doing with the Rail Safety Act, but as well that they be working on safety management system regulations too. And today we found from the Auditor General that's not the case. We have these recommendations, we accept them, and Transport Canada provided a plan, and we will implement that plan. All right, but the question here is, does Transport Canada need more inspectors after the Auditor General found that it only completed a quarter of its planned audits on the safety management system? What's the plan? Is it more inspectors? The plan set out today, that Transport Canada has indicated the path forward. They have to figure out how many resources they need to pull in the safety management system audit side of it. We have increased inspectors though, Evan. We've actually increased the number of inspectors last year to 30,000, highest year ever. So they're out there doing their work on rail safety and ensuring that companies are adhering to the regulations that we passed. On the audit side though, they're not completing audits. It's not acceptable. And as I indicated to them, we all agree this is not what Canadians expect. The minister was somewhat more ambiguous in her comments about the public service and blame attribution. In an interview with the CBC again, she was asked by Dave Seglins, you used the word fail, this is in 2015, you used the word failings. Has there been any accountability within Transport Canada? Has anybody lost their job over the way things were or were not enforced at MMA? MMA is Montreal, Maine, Atlantic, the company that owned the Lac-Mégantic train. Mr. Transport, if you take a look at the current listing of people who are in Transport Canada, you see there's a marked difference than the people who were in Transport Canada pre-2013. A lot of it was natural turnover. There was a lot of retirements happening. And you know, the management of the department lies with the Deputy Minister. And I think he's done an excellent job of making sure that we have the right group and the right mix of people going forward. I think the department's in a really good place to make sure that the lessons we need to learn from Lac-Mégantic, from the derailment, from the other derailments, from the Auditor General's report are going to be implemented. And I have great confidence that they will. But were those changes around accountability? Anybody moved in or out because of the way things were or were not? I leave it to the Deputy Minister to make his assessment of who needs to be in what position and changes were made. So it's difficult to decipher if people lost their jobs because of negligence or retirement. She alludes to both possibilities without being clear about either. She makes no reference to any process of holding people to account. She's also unclear about why the minister is comfortable with the new arrangement. This type of response existed for the minister partly because of the opaque definition of ministerial responsibility. The definition includes enough ambiguity that ministers can deny responsibility for operational failures. It is ironic, however, that the minister would claim credit for any progress. The example demonstrates that there continues to be important limits on transparency and accountability at the political and bureaucratic level. Moreover, trustworthiness requires openness, knowledge, and concern among those seeking to be trusted. According to the literature, I would suggest that as responsibility gets shifted to a nameless, faceless bureaucracy that is much less able to answer for itself, the government undermines the trust it's seeking to establish in its CI strategy. Peter's second type of accountability, responsibility, the government arguably did a better job than it did with answerability, particularly in the aftermath of the event. The minister noted that the government had no responsibility for the Lac-Mégantic derailment, which may be legally true, but is ironic at the very least, given the government's regulatory role before such events, the claims made in the audits, and the financial exposure in the aftermath of such events. In fact, the government did respond to the event with a number of initiatives. With respect to responsiveness, how the government's response aligns with public expectations is more difficult to determine. There's no question that the public expects rigorous form of review after an event like MacEachen, that victims should be recognized and compensated for their suffering, and that systems should be put in place to prevent similar incidents. Despite the media coverage, however, it's difficult to determine the level of public concern over the matter. Notwithstanding their concerns over safety, small communities argued to keep the trains coming to their communities because of their important economic value. There's still a high level of public resistance to pipelines in many parts of the country, despite some evidence to suggest that they are much safer than rail. In the last federal election, Lac-Mégantic was hardly mentioned, and the new government was prepared to conclude settlement quickly without having to accept responsibility, as the new minister himself indicated. In this sense, the public is implicated in the matter. Again, we see a pattern of fascination and aversion, but neither of these things fundamentally changes attitudes towards public policy, which has implications for how we approach CI. In our view, it should lead to more audits, more transparency, more thoughtful public engagement, as we discuss in more detail in the book. So in sum, we spend a lot of time talking about information exchange in critical infrastructure fora. Information exchange is an ambiguous form of control. People make assumptions about what you will do with this information that may or may not be so. Standard setting behavior change are also important elements of a control mechanism, but they get comparatively less attention. While the concept of trust is not clearly defined in CI strategy documents, it would seem that the government is actually referring to trust in markets, and perhaps even a form of corporatism. Governments focus on strengthening trust with industry. This trust comes at a price, non-disclosure agreements, and a comparatively weak enforcement. Governments seem to worry less about building trust with the citizenry, a group largely overlooked in government CI strategies, most CI strategies in fact, not just in Canada, most CI strategies. And one whom government should perhaps be concerned about, given the low levels of trust among the public towards government and the owners and operators of CI. So that's a somewhat debatable claim because, of course, a bit of distrust and skepticism would serve us well also. That noted, many of the formal accountability systems are slow, selective, and opaque, like the courts, and the informal ones can be reactive and misguided, like the media. Many of the events we looked at did not have an independent inquiry, for example. The government did not hold an inquiry after Lac-Mégantic, for example. While the minister noted the event was studied by the TSB and that Transport Canada's safety oversight was audited by the Auditor General, the TSB looked only at the Lac-Mégantic derailment, and the Auditor General does not investigate the private rail companies. Moreover, neither report provided much by way of public testimony, as we saw in the inquiries following Walkerton, Elliott Lake parking collapse, and the waterfall train accident in Australia, for example, all three of which resulted in far fewer deaths and much less destruction than the events in Lac-Mégantic. In addition, the 2007 safety review, as well as the Auditor General and TSB reports, concluded that there were recurring problems with management and oversight. This is all the more reason why it's surprising that a disaster described by the TSB as not being the fault of one person or organization would not warrant an independent and far-reaching examination, especially for a country that depends so much on the transportation of dangerous goods by rail. As we underscored throughout the book, more independent audits would help to hold CI owners and operators and government regulators to account. But audits themselves are not a panacea. The term lessons learned in these audits is overused and misleading. We should instead refer to lessons identified. There is often little evidence that the lessons have resulted in meaningful systemic changes, particularly in the short term, and even if people do learn lessons, it's not clear that they learned the right ones or that they are prepared to make the fundamental changes that would generate different results. People's optimism about learning lessons is an expression of hope over experience. Studies of organizational culture suggest organizations learn lessons consistent with the survival of the organizational culture. They are often deaf to lessons that challenge it. In a sense, stability and learning can be competing concepts. In other words, organizations learn only what they need to in order to be stable. It is not unusual, for instance, for an audit to conclude that an organizational failure occurred because of the lack of expertise, leadership, standardization, and process. These are the core characteristics of bureaucracy. Public sector auditors usually reinforce bureaucratic characteristics. They do not challenge them. In other words, oversight requires more diversity than simply bureaucratic auditors. Audits can, however, make more and broader range of information available in the public domain for increased scrutiny by legislators, academics, advocates for victims, the growing number of think tanks and non-governmental organizations, and the public in general. Auditors, as well as concerned citizens groups, should also track more aggressively the progress government agencies and CI owners and operators are making with respect to recommendations, as we saw following the audit of the waterfall train accident in Australia. Similar websites, clear and accessible and independent from government, should be established and maintained following disasters. to monitor progress against all recommendations. This monitoring should continue until the organizations have addressed the recommendations. Finally, I'll note that our infrastructure planning needs to take into account not simply today's threats, but also the threats and opportunities of the future. The Canadian government's plan to spend as much as $800 billion over the next decade on infrastructure. The federal government plans to double its contribution to $180 billion over the next 12 years. What is clear is that the government will continue to depend on the private sector in the area of critical infrastructure. Of the federal government's planned spending, $35 billion will be used to establish an infrastructure bank to finance projects with the private sector and other orders of government. Government hopes to take advantage of the industry's expertise, cash reserves, entrepreneurialism, and innovation to help Canada become a greener and more tech-savvy society. These new investments will change our risk profile. Government also has a regulatory and formal leadership role to play. Its role is qualitatively different from the private sector. By sitting at a round table as a partner, as government sometimes describes itself, it potentially compromises its ability to play the role of enforcer and loses sight of its accountability to the public. This should never happen. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much.